Welcome. In this chapter of our journey, we shall unearth the stories of the early 20th century, exploring the representative innovations and inventions in the world of food that defined the era. We will look beyond the mere facts and discover the curious tales, the happy accidents, and the cultural currents that gave them life. Our feature presentation begins now. The first decade of the 20th century for human history. This was undeniably a monumental 10 years. It was an age of titans and miracles. In 1903, the Wright brothers achieved the first controlled, powered flight, finally realizing humanity's ancient dream of soaring through the heavens. Then, in 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Model T, which truly transformed the automobile from a plaything for the wealthy into a consumer product within the grasp of the masses. These great inventions, without a doubt, profoundly changed the course of human life from that point forward. But while engines roared and propellers whirred, a quieter revolution was taking place on another front. Within the hallowed and illustrated annals of food and drink, this decade was an equally dazzling stage. The first star to make his entrance was likely a Swiss chemist by the name of Albert Wander. In the year 1904, in his hometown of Bern, this gentleman invented a nutritional supplement, a fortifying blend concocted from malt, milk, eggs, and cocoa. In 1909, after it was exported to Britain, a small but fateful error occurred during the trademark registration. A clerk, in a moment of oversight, misspelled the original Latin name, ovo maltine ovo, signifying the egg. The name was mistakenly written down as the simpler, more streamlined Ovaltine. And just like that, the great name of Ovaltine was born, bursting onto the scene and rapidly sweeping across Britain and the rest of Europe. Now, if we speak of Ovaltine's original purpose, it was intended as a health product, sold in pharmacies with the aim of improving malnutrition in children. But because of its characteristic high in sugar, high in calories, it ironically became a favoured beverage among early mountaineers. For instance, the New Zealand explorer Sir Edmund Hillary, who would later be the first to conquer Mount Everest, carried a substantial amount of Ovaltine with him as a vital source of energy for his historic ascent. And then, in the very next year after Ovaltine's invention, a Bulgarian doctor and microbiologist named Stepan Grigorov made his own major contribution to the world's diet. This man, at the tender age of 27 and working in a microbiology laboratory in Geneva, discovered a specific, rod-shaped bacterium. This natural bacterial strain not only helped dairy products to ferment with remarkable efficiency, but it also effectively inhibited spoilage during production and storage. It is fair to say that today, the reason we can enjoy such a dazzling array of yogurt products owes a debt, in some measure, to this singular scientific achievement from all those years ago. The scientific community would eventually name the strain he discovered Lactobacillus bulgaricus, in honor of his homeland. And Stepan Grigorov's quest to benefit humanity did not stop there. A year later, he collaborated with a key member of the French Pasteur Institute, the bacteriologist Albert Calmet, to establish a treatment for tuberculosis centered on the use of penicillin mold. This was a full 22 years, 2 decades, and 2 springs before Alexander Fleming's formal discovery of penicillin in 1928. In recognition of Stepan Grigorov's outstanding contributions, the Antarctic Place Names Committee would later name a glacier in the Palmer Archipelago the Grigorov Glacier. And on his birthday, October 27th, even Google's search box Doodle has honored him with a special illustration. Now, within the 1910s, the year 1912 is absolutely one worth writing home about. In the East, the Republic of China was formally declared in Nanjing on January 1st of that year. In the West, across the New World, the United States of America, after incorporating New Mexico and Arizona into its map, completed the construction of its 48 contiguous states. And upon the ocean, the unsinkable giant, the Titanic, set sail from Southampton bound for New York, only to collide with an iceberg in the North Atlantic late on the night of April 14th, resulting in one of the most famous maritime disasters in human history. But in the realm of food, the most significant event of 1912 may have occurred on March 6. Inside a factory in the Chelsea neighborhood of New York City, one of the best-selling cookies in human history was born, the Oreo. This exquisitely crafted biscuit, constructed with a border of 90 ridges, embossed with 12 small laurel flowers and further decorated with 12 short lines and 12 dots, now in over 100 countries, sold a cumulative total of more than 500 billion units. At the same time, the story of Oreo's own growth is practically synonymous with the history of the world's leading biscuit giant Nabisco. In short, when the Bostonian Adolphus Green consolidated over 40 bakeries from the American Midwest into the National Biscuit Company, and in doing so achieved the milestone of being the first to sell cookies in sealed packages, he likely could never have imagined that his flagship product, the Oreo, would one day lead to March 6 being defined as National Oreo Day for Americans. And besides the birth of the Oreo, Another major event in the food world of 1912 was the work of American botanist Frederick Coville and his colleagues. Through their efforts, they successfully domesticated the blueberry for the first time. It began to formally enter the American market, was introduced to Europe in the 1930s and from there spread across the entire globe. By 1913, we see the creation of what is perhaps one of the most famous confectionery products from the British Isles. A candy bar made of multiple layers of chocolate coating wrapped around a brittle, honeycomb-like toffee centre, the violet crumble. It was successfully developed by Hordley's Chocolates in South Melbourne, Australia. Then, by 1918, Fox's Confectionery in the United Kingdom developed what was once England's most famous hard candy, Fox's Glacier Mints. Due to the candy's absolutely unique, crystal clear body and its coolly refreshing peppermint flavour, a polar bear, famously named Peppy, became the perfect mascot for the product. However, what is rather surprising is that in that wilder era of the early 20th century, Fox's Confectionery, in its subsequent promotional activities, actually commissioned a hunter to shoot and kill a real polar bear. They then had it taxidermied and displayed it far and wide as a marketing tool, a practice that continued all the way until 1969. Finally, at the end of the 1910s, the First World War, a conflict with a death toll far exceeding the sum of all wars in the preceding 100 years, at last drew its curtains, and the American soldiers, returning home from the battlefields, brought with them a Parisian street food that had become popular in the 19th century: fried potato sticks, or as we know them, French fries. In the burgeoning fast food culture that followed, this item became more and more sought after, eventually becoming one of the most widely accepted snacks in the entire world. The 1920s. The human history, this was a period of recovery and revitalization from the anguish of war. In this decade of relative peace, which also simmered with infinite contradictions, a few seemingly trivial yet absolutely sweet and delightful sugar candies became the protagonists in the story of food's development. First, in 1922, the all-purpose candy in the hearts of Australians, a treat with profound influence in both the culinary and cultural sphere, the Minty, was newly created by a man named James Stidman. The candy's original form was a rectangular, white, mint-flavoured sweet. Once chewed, however, it would become exceptionally sticky. There were even extreme cases where it was known to pull out a user's dentures, roots and all. But perhaps its greatest fame wasn't due to its taste, but rather to the comic strips printed on its wrapper, titled Minty's Moments. Nearly every well-known cartoonist in Oceania, figures like Jimmy Banks and Norman Hetherington, lent their pen and paper to create art for it. This marketing technique would be emulated by many who came after. Time moves to 1924. Japan, having completed its modern reforms, delivered its own first creation in Western-style confectionery, a soft, chewy and refreshingly citrus-flavored candy known as bottoname or botan rice candy. The most unique feature of this candy was its edible outer wrapper, made from dried rice paper. In its day, this was an inexpensive candy aimed at Japanese elementary school children, so the portion size was usually quite small. But the outer packaging was absolutely vibrant and colourful, and it even came with stickers and prizes, a trifecta of gimmicks that children were absolutely powerless to refuse. Then, in 1925 in Europe, the snack brand McVitie's, now under the British United Biscuits Company, began the industrialised, mass production of the famous chocolate digestive biscuit. This was a food originally invented in the early 19th century, first marketed by two doctors as an aid for digestion. Its greatest characteristic was the pioneering use of sodium bicarbonate in the baking process, which was a tremendous step forward for the texture of biscuits. And in the so-called Roaring Twenties, McVitie's went beyond the original recipe, covering the biscuit in caramel and chocolate, elevating the flavour of the digestive by more than just a single notch. And so, as soon as this product hit the market, it rapidly swept through Great Britain, quickly being selected for the list of Britain's top 10 tea-time snacks. To this day, it remains the UK's best-selling biscuit, with sales of 80 million packs per year. Finally, in 1928, in the American city of Philadelphia, another great invention in the world of food was born. The famous confectioner Walter Dimer, during an experiment to develop a new chewing gum, accidentally invented a strange new gum that was less sticky than its predecessors, yet could be used to easily blow enormous bubbles. And just like that, the epoch-making double bubble gum was created, and in its very first year, sales exceeded $1.5 million. At the time, to help with sales, Dimer himself and his colleagues even went out personally to major retailers, painstakingly teaching customers how to blow bigger and better bubbles. When I think about it, the fact that I as a child managed to master this art without any instruction, well, to say I was a gifted child wouldn't be an overstatement, now would it? You believe you know chocolate. You hold a bar in your hand, a familiar weight. You know the satisfying crackle of the foil, the clean, sharp snap as you break off a square. You anticipate the slow, luxurious melt on your tongue, a wave of creamy, sweet, complex flavor. It is a reliable comfort, a small, accessible indulgence. You might prefer it dark and bitter, or milky and sweet, or perhaps even a controversial white. But the essence of it, the very soul of what chocolate is, feels immutable, timeless. Now, I want you to forget all of that. I want you to imagine a different kind of chocolate. A chocolate from a time of gaslight and horse-drawn carriages, of sprawling empires and breathtaking poverty. It is called, simply, vanilla chocolate. The name sounds quaint, perhaps a little plain. It evokes images of old-fashioned candy shops, of simple, honest treats, but this simplicity is a profound deception. Because the substance hiding behind that gentle name is an alien creature for your modern palate. It is a historical phantom, a forgotten taste that holds the secrets of an entire era within its gritty, unpredictable, and sometimes dangerous heart. So, what was this Victorian vanilla chocolate? Was it a primitive milk chocolate? A precursor to the white chocolate we know today? And if you were to travel back in time and be offered a piece, what would you actually be eating? The answer is far more complex and shocking than you might imagine. It is a story not of a single confection, but of a revolution fought in kitchens and factories, in laboratories and on distant plantations. It is a story of science, of fraud, of empire, and of the very birth of modern desire. To understand this ghost on the wrapper, we must not just learn its recipe. We must reconstruct its world, one strange and unsettling bite at a time. Before we can taste this forgotten chocolate, you must first unlearn what you know. Let's begin in a place of radical simplicity, in an early, Victorian kitchen, sometime around 1840. You are not a wealthy aristocrat, you are a member of the burgeoning middle class, with a little disposable income and a taste for the novelties of the age. You have purchased a small, dark, unassuming block labelled vanilla chocolate. Let's start with the second word, chocolate. For you, chocolate is a solid treat. But for most of its history in Europe, and for the first decades of the Victorian era, chocolate was overwhelmingly a drink. It arrived from the New World as a coarse, bitter, unsweetened paste, a stimulant and a medicine prized by the elite. It was prepared by grating a hard block of this processed cacao into hot water or milk, whisking it furiously into a frothy, often gritty beverage. It was earthy, potent, and closer to a strong, unsweetened espresso than to the sweet, comforting hot cocoa of your childhood. The solid eating chocolate you hold in your hand is a relatively new invention, and it carries the ghost of its liquid origins. It is not designed for pleasure in the way you understand it. It is dense, it is coarse, and it is profoundly, unapologetically bitter. The primary goal of its manufacturer was not to create a sublime sensory experience, but to create a stable, transportable, and profitable product. Now, for the first word, vanilla. Today, vanilla is the baseline of sweetness, the default flavor for ice cream and cake. Its presence is so common it has become synonymous with plain. But in 1840, vanilla was an almost mythical substance. It was an orchid, the Vanilla planifolia, native exclusively to a small region of modern-day Mexico, where it was pollinated by a single specialized species of bee. For centuries, every attempt to cultivate it elsewhere in the world had failed. The vines would grow, but they would never bear fruit. This made vanilla one of the most expensive spices on the planet, second only to saffron. Its flavor was a symbol of extreme luxury, of colonial power, and of exotic, faraway lands. The scent was not the simple, one-note sweetness of a modern extract. It was a complex perfume of over 200 different aromatic compounds, smoky, floral, woody, and creamy all at once. To add real vanilla to a product was an act of audacious extravagance. It was a declaration of quality, a signal to the consumer that this was not common fare. So, you have these two elements. On one hand, a bitter, gritty, functional cacao product. On the other, a spice of almost unimaginable rarity and expense. Vanilla chocolate was therefore a profound statement. It was the marriage of a rustic, medicinal substance with the most aristocratic of flavors. It promised the consumer a taste of two worlds, the invigorating power of the cacao bean and the opulent perfume of the imperial pantry. It was an aspirational product, selling a dream of sophistication. But the reality of that dream, as you are about to discover, was a very different matter. The promise on the label and this substance in your hand were often separated by a chasm of technological limitation and cynical deception. Let's take your first bite. Prepare yourself. This is not a passive experience. You unwrap the small, dark block from its simple paper packaging. There is no foil. The surface is not glossy and smooth like the tempered chocolate you know. It is dull, slightly mottled, and has a matte, almost chalky appearance. There might be faint streaks of a lighter brown or white, where the cocoa butter has separated and bloomed to the surface. This is not a sign of spoilage, but a hallmark of its creation. You try to snap off a piece. It doesn't snap. There is no satisfying crack. The bar crumbles and shears, breaking with a soft, dull thud. It takes a surprising amount of pressure. You place a piece in your mouth. Do not expect it to melt. The first sensation is not flavor, but texture. It is gritty, sandy. You can feel individual particles on your tongue, distinct and sharp. There are these coarse crystals of sugar, which have not been pulverized into oblivion, but remain as tiny, crunchy rocks. Then there are the cacao particles themselves, ground but not refined, leaving a fibrous, almost earthy residue in your mouth. The experience is closer to eating a compressed mixture of fine sand and sugar than it is to eating a modern chocolate bar. This texture is the direct result of the technology of the time. The secret to modern chocolate's melt-in-the-mouth perfection is a process called kunching, invented by Rodolphe Lindt in 1879. Kunching involves placing chocolate liquor in a large, heated vat with rollers that grind back and forth for hours, even days. This marathon of friction and aeration does two things. It breaks the sugar and cacao particles down to a microscopic size, smaller than your tongue can detect, and it evenly coats every single one of these tiny particles in a thin, slick layer of cocoa butter. But you are in a pre-conching world. Your chocolate was likely made by grinding roasted cacao beans between stone rollers, a method not far removed from the traditional Mesoamerican metate. The process was imprecise. The particles were large and irregular. The cocoa butter, the natural fat of the bean, was not evenly distributed. So as you chew this Victorian chocolate, you get pockets of dry, chalky powder, interspersed with sudden, greasy slicks of oil as a clump of cocoa butter melts. It is a disjointed, chaotic experience. And the flavor? It is overwhelmingly, intensely bitter. The cacao in its natural state is astringent and harsh. The sweetness from the coarse sugar is there, but it's a separate event, a crunchy burst that happens alongside the bitterness rather than blending with it. And then, slowly, underneath the grit, and the grease, and the bitterness, you begin to detect another note. A faint, haunting perfume. A whisper of smoke and flowers. It's the vanilla. It's not a forward, sugary flavor. It is a ghost in the machine. A complex aromatic working desperately to mask the rustic character of the chocolate itself. It's a touch of aristocratic perfume on a coarse, working-class fabric. Congratulations. You have just experienced the baseline of early Victorian vanilla chocolate. It was a workout for the jaw and a challenge for the palate. And this, remember, is the best-case scenario. This is the honest product. Most of the time, you are not so lucky. The grit in your mouth might not have been cacao at all. Welcome to the golden age of food fraud. The Victorian era, for all its romanticized progress, was a cesspool of adulteration. Without effective government regulation, a free market philosophy, and a rapidly growing urban population disconnected from the sources of its food, the temptation for producers to cut corners was irresistible. And chocolate, a luxury product with a dark color and strong flavor, was a perfect canvas for deception. Let's return to your hypothetical purchase. You are tempted by a cheaper bar of vanilla chocolate. It looks the part. It smells vaguely of chocolate. You buy it and take it home. You take a bite. The texture is still gritty, but it's different. It's softer, starchier. It coats your tongue with a pasty film. What are you eating? To stretch the expensive cacao, a Victorian confectioner had a whole pantry of cheap fillers at his disposal. The most common was starch. Potato, flour, sago flour, or arrowroot would be mixed in to add bulk and weight. They were cheap, they were white, and their flavor could be easily masked by a little bit of low-grade cacao and sugar. But the real artistry of the adulterer lay in color and texture. An honest chocolate maker's biggest expense after cacao and sugar was cocoa butter, the rich fat that gave chocolate its melting quality. A fraudulent maker would press as much of this valuable fat out of the cacao as possible to sell it separately to pharmacists or cosmetic companies. This left him with a dry, pale, crumbly powder. To make this look like chocolate again, he needed to add a cheap fat and a dark colorant. The fat was often mutton tallow, rendered sheep fat. Imagine that flavor in your mouth. A greasy, lanolin-like taste mingling with the bitterness of cheap cacao. It doesn't melt cleanly. It congeals on the roof of your mouth, a waxy, unpleasant residue. For the color, the options were grimly creative. The most benign was finely ground roasted peas or chicory root. But to achieve that rich, reddish-brown hue of quality chocolate, many turned to minerals. You might be tasting finely pulverized brick dust, adding not only color and weight, but an extra layer of abrasive grit. Or, for a particularly vibrant, tempting red, the secret ingredient could be red lead, a potent neurotoxin. For a dark, rich brown, they might use umber or Venetian red, pigments normally reserved for a painter's canvas. You are, quite literally, eating paint. This was not a rare occurrence. This was the norm, especially for the cheaper products aimed at the working classes who longed for a taste of the good life. An 1851 study by the physician Arthur Hill, who pioneered the use of microscopy to detect food adulteration, found that of 56 chocolate samples he examined in London, nearly all of them were adulterated with something. His work, published in the medical journal The Lancet, caused a national scandal. People were horrified to learn that their comforting cup of cocoa might be laced with brick dust, and their children's sweets coloured with lead. So when we ask what was Victorian vanilla chocolate, the answer must include this dark reality. It was often a lie. A confection of cheap starch, animal fat, and industrial minerals, all masked by a little bit of sugar, a whisper of low-grade cacao, and a hint of vanilla. Spoiler alert, the vanilla was often fake, too. But that's a story for a little later. First, we need to understand how the very nature of chocolate, and the vanilla that flavored it, were about to be transformed by a moral crusade and a boy on a tiny, faraway island. Our story of chocolate is, at this point, a rather grim affair of grit and fraud. But two revolutions, happening thousands of miles apart, were about to change everything. One was botanical, the other industrial and moral. Let's travel first to the French island of Réunion in the Indian Ocean, in the year 1841. This is where vanilla, the flavor of the elite, was democratized. For centuries, the vanilla orchid was a Mexican monopoly. But here, on Réunion, a 12-year-old enslaved boy named Edmund Albius made a discovery that would change the world of flavor forever. He was walking through his master's vanilla plantation, where the vines grew lushly but never fruited. With a thin stick, or a blade of grass, Edmund demonstrated a simple, brilliant technique. He lifted the rostellum, the small flap inside the orchid that separated the male and female parts, and with his thumb, pressed them together. He had discovered hand pollination. It was a gesture that took seconds, but it broke the Mexican monopoly. Suddenly, vanilla could be cultivated anywhere with the right climate: Réunion, Madagascar, Tahiti, Indonesia. The price of vanilla began a slow, steady fall from the stratosphere. It was still a luxury, but it was no longer an impossibility for a middle-class product. The discovery of a young, enslaved boy made the vanilla in vanilla chocolate a more achievable and more honest promise. Meanwhile, back in England, a different kind of revolution was brewing, driven by a powerful moral conviction. The great names of English chocolate-free, Cadbury, Rowntree are all founded by Quakers. This is not a coincidence. The Quakers were deeply involved in the temperance movement, the social crusade against the evils of alcohol. They saw the gin palaces and beer halls of industrial England as dens of vice that destroyed families and communities. They needed to offer a virtuous alternative, something warm, comforting, and nourishing that could be enjoyed in the home. Their answer was chocolate. They marketed their drinking chocolate not as a decadent treat, but as a wholesome, moral beverage. A cup of Cadbury's cocoa was a blow against alcoholism. But to sell this vision, they had to be beyond reproach. Their names had to be synonymous with purity in an age of rampant adulteration. They built their brands on the promise of an honest product. The Cadbury's or Fry's chocolate would contain only cacao and sugar, nothing more. This commitment to quality drove them to innovate. In 1847, Joseph Fry of Bristol made a pivotal breakthrough. He had been using the new hydraulic presses, invented by the Dutchman Coenraad van Houten, to squeeze the cocoa butter out of the beans to make a less fatty cocoa powder. But Fry had a brilliant idea. What if he took that extracted cocoa butter and mixed it back in? Not with water, but with cocoa powder and sugar. Result was a paste that was thick, malleable, and could be pressed into a mold. When it cooled, it set into a solid block. He had created the first modern chocolate bar. This was a game changer. This wasn't just compressed powder anymore. It was a true confection. It was still gritty, still not the silky product we know, but it was a solid, stable, and most importantly, pure foundation. Now, the stage was set. You had a more affordable, globally sourced vanilla thanks to Edmund Albius, and you had a purer, more reliable form of solid chocolate thanks to the moral and industrial innovations of the Quakers. The two were ready to meet in a new and much more refined way. The era of the true vanilla chocolate bar was dawning. Let us jump forward in time again, to the 1880s. Queen Victoria is an old woman now, the Empress of India. Her empire is at its zenith, a global network of trade, industry, and power. And the world of chocolate has been utterly transformed. Step into a high-end confectioner's shop in London or Paris. The air itself is different. The smell is not just of sugar, but of a deep, rich, roasted aroma, a complex perfume that is both familiar and intensely luxurious. In the glass cases are chocolates molded into intricate shapes, seashells, flowers, animals. They are glossy, dark, and impossibly smooth. This is the product of the final great 19th century chocolate revolution, the conching machine. Imagine you are in Rodolphe Alliance factory in Switzerland in 1879. You see his invention, a long, granite-lined trough shaped like a conch shell, which gives it its name. Inside, a heavy granite roller moves back and forth, slowly, relentlessly, grinding the chocolate mixture. The process generates a gentle heat from friction. For hours. For days. What you are witnessing is alchemy. The constant grinding pulverizes the sugar and cacao particles to a size of fewer than 20 microns, so small that your tongue can no longer perceive them as individual grains. The gentle heat and aeration allow volatile acids and bitter compounds to evaporate, mellowing the harsh flavors of the cacao. And most importantly, the endless motion ensures that every single microscopic particle is coated in a uniform, gossamer-thin layer of cocoa butter. When you place a piece of this conched chocolate in your mouth, the effect is magical. The warmth of your tongue is just enough to melt the crystalline structure of the cocoa butter. The entire solid matrix collapses at once, releasing all the flavor in a smooth, velvety flood across your palate. There is no grit. No greasy separation. Just a seamless, luxurious melt. This is the birth of modern chocolate texture. And in this new, smoother, less bitter world, vanilla's role changes completely. In the old, gritty chocolate, vanilla was a perfume struggling to cover up the product's rustic flaws. It was a masker of off notes, a desperate attempt at sophistication. In conched chocolate, it is a partner. It is a vital heart of the symphony of flavor. The floral, creamy notes of a good vanilla bean round out the deep, fruity notes of the cacao. It adds what the French call rondeur, a roundness and fullness to the flavor profile. It is no longer just a scent, it is an integral part of the taste. This late Victorian vanilla chocolate is a world away from its ancestor of the 1840s. It is smooth, it is balanced, it is sophisticated. It is a true luxury item, the result of decades of innovation. But progress, as always, has its shadow. As the demand for this new, delicious chocolate boomed, so did the demand for its key flavoring. Real vanilla, even with global cultivation, was still labor-intensive and expensive. Science, as it so often does, offered a shortcut. In the 1870s, chemists discovered how to synthesize vanillin, the primary flavor compound in vanilla, from cheaper sources like pine bark, clove oil, and later the waste effluent from paper mills. This synthetic vanillin was a chemical ghost. It had the primary scent of vanilla, but it was a caricature. It lacked the 200 other aromatic compounds that gave real vanilla its complexity, and depth. It was the simple, one-note flavor you associate with cheap vanilla candles or car air fresheners. But it was incredibly cheap. A new divide was created. The finest, most expensive vanilla chocolates from makers, like Cadbury or Lindt, proudly advertised their use of real vanilla beans. But the mass-market bars, the penny chocolates for children, began to use synthetic vanillin. The word vanilla, on a wrapper, became ambiguous. Was it the scent of a hand-pollinated orchid from Madagascar, or the product of a German chemical factory? For most people, the taste of chocolate was now permanently entwined with the taste of the simpler, cheaper, industrial ghost. We have journeyed from gritty, adulterated blocks to smooth, conched bars. We have seen vanilla evolve from a rare perfume to a ubiquitous flavor, both real and synthetic. There is one final, crucial piece of the puzzle we must address. The question that lingers in the modern mind when we hear vanilla chocolate: was it white? The answer is an emphatic no. But the confusion is understandable. The term vanilla chocolate described the flavor, not the color. It was chocolate, meaning it was made from the whole cacao bean cocoa solids and cocoa butter, and it was flavored with vanilla. It was, by its very nature, brown. So where does the idea of a white vanilla chocolate come from? It comes from the invention of milk chocolate and the subsequent creation of white chocolate itself. In 1875, a Swiss chocolatier named Daniel Peter, a neighbor of Henry Nestle who had recently invented a process for making powdered milk, had an idea. He decided to mix Nestle's milk powder into his chocolate mixture. The result was a sensation. It was sweeter, creamier, and milder than dark chocolate. Chocolate or late, or milk chocolate, was born. It quickly became the most popular type of chocolate in the world. This new milk chocolate also contained vanilla. Vanilla's creamy, gentle flavor profile is a perfect partner for the lactic, caramelized notes of milk chocolate. So the association continued. Chocolate, milk, and vanilla became a holy trinity of confection. The invention of what we now call white chocolate came much later, likely in the 1930s in Switzerland. Confectioners realized they could create a new kind of product by taking the pale, fatty cocoa butter, which they had in abundance from making cocoa powder, and mixing it with milk powder, sugar, and a heavy dose of vanilla. Crucially, it contains zero cocoa solids, the brown part of the bean that gives dark and milk chocolate their characteristic flavor and color. White chocolate is, in essence, solidified, sweetened, vanilla-flavored cocoa butter. Because it lacks the bitter cocoa solids, the vanilla flavor is much more prominent. It is the star of the show. Over time, this has cemented the popular association: if the dominant flavor is vanilla and the confection is pale, it must be white chocolate. Therefore, to look for Victorian vanilla chocolate in the modern white chocolate aisle is to chase a ghost down the wrong corridor of history. Victorian vanilla chocolate was fundamentally chocolate. It was a product of the cacao solids. Its identity was rooted in the dark, bitter bean, enhanced and elevated by the perfume of the vanilla orchid. The idea of a chocolate without the chocolate, a bar made only of the fat, would have been nonsensical to them. It was a product whose very name, vanilla chocolate, defined it as a duality, a partnership between two powerful, exotic, and celebrated flavors. One dark and robust, the other light and aromatic, fused together first by crude mechanics and later by industrial alchemy. So, we return to our original question. What was Victorian vanilla chocolate, and what is its closest modern counterpart? As you have seen, there is no single answer, because it was not a single thing. It was an idea in motion, a reflection of a century of tumultuous change. To ask for one modern equivalent is like asking for a single photograph to represent a human life. Instead, we must look for its echoes, the descendants of its different life stages. If you wish to taste the ghost of early Victorian vanilla chocolate, the gritty, challenging bar of the 1840s, you must venture into the world of craft, bean-to-bar chocolate. Seek out a stone-ground chocolate. These bars are made using traditional, low-tech methods that deliberately preserve a coarser texture. Look for one with a high cacao percentage, perhaps 70 or 80%, and one that contains coarse, unrefined sugar crystals. If you can find one flavored with a real vanilla bean, you are getting remarkably close. It will be an intense, textured, and perhaps slightly startling experience. It will not be a comforting indulgence, but a history lesson for your palate. Forget the brick dust and sheep fat. This is as close to the honest, pre-industrial original as you would ever want to get. If, however, you wish to taste the ghost of late Victorian vanilla chocolate, The product of the Quaker's morals and Lynch's genius, your search is different. You are looking for the spirit of that innovation. The closest counterpart would be a high-quality dark chocolate, around 70% cacao, from a maker who, like the Quakers, prides themselves on purity. It must be a bar that has been conched to silken perfection. And most importantly, it must be one that uses real, high-quality vanilla Madagascar or Tahitian, not as a background whisper of vanillin, but as a celebrated, forward flavor. It is a bar that showcases the harmonious marriage of a beautifully refined cacao and a complex, aromatic vanilla. This is the culmination of the Victorian dream, a pure, sophisticated, and utterly delicious confection, born from a century of struggle and invention. There is no modern counterpart, because Victorian vanilla chocolate was a product of a world without choice. Today you can choose from infinite variations of texture, origin, and flavor. For the Victorians, their chocolate was simply the product of their time. It was the taste of the Industrial Revolution, with all its brilliant innovation and its dark, grimy corners. It was the taste of empire, of a spice grown by a slave boy on one side of the world and a bean harvested by labourers on the other, brought together in a noisy English factory. The story of this forgotten confection is the story of how we learn to perfect our pleasures. It's a reminder that the simple, reliable comfort of a chocolate bar in your hand is not simple at all. It is a dense artifact, the culmination of countless small revolutions, of failures and frauds, of moral crusades and scientific breakthroughs. The smooth melt on your tongue is the ghost of the conching machine. The complex flavor is the ghost of Edmond Albius' clever hands. The next time you unwrap a bar of chocolate, pause for a moment before you take a bite. Think of the grit, the tallow, the brick dust. Think of the slow, relentless grinding of the conch, transforming a coarse paste into liquid silk. You are holding the end of a long, strange, and fascinating story. A story that is now, finally, complete.